My name's Anthony Fox. I am the Strategic Business Manager here with the Countercept business unit within F-Secure. For anyone who is not yet aware of what Countercept does, we are a specialist business unit within F-Secure that looks at detection and response. And so what that means is that we're actually helping organizations to battle live attacks as they happen. There is a range of services that we offer, from a fully managed service all the way through to just advice and consulting on building out your own detection and response sort of capabilities. So we have a fair amount of expertise in understanding about a little bit about the threat actors that different organizations are facing, and how they actually work, what their motivations are, what the potential attack paths might be, etc. So I wanted to just talk to you a little bit about, first up, the different types of threat intelligence that we talk about. And there are three different types, as you probably all are aware. Today we're going to be talking about or looking at strategic threat intelligence. And that is, as I said, things like the specific threat actors that we know about, the potential attack paths that they're using, and the motivations behind those types of attacks. There is, of course, also operational threat intelligence, which is a little bit more granular, and it starts to look at the TTPs used in those attack paths. And then there's tactical, so that's IOCs and lists of signatures that you're probably all very well aware of. Just thinking about those different types of threat intelligence, and as I said, we work with a range of different organizations to understand their detection and response needs and what they should be doing to respond to live attacks as they happen. That has actually positioned us really, really well to be able to then use that information again with new clients as they're coming on board, and be able to consult to businesses about the specific risks that they're facing, the specific threats. And that has led to this idea of a very threat-led sort of philosophy. So rather than thinking about just general security and increasing a general security posture, we like to focus and prioritize resourcing and budgeting on those threats or those risks that are going to have the biggest impact to the security posture of an organization. So we're thinking about specifically at an industry and business level, what are those threats that a business is facing, and how should we best counter those? All right, so let's get into a little bit about what we know so far this year, and even over the last sort of 12 months. As you probably are all aware, just in the last sort of 10 days, in the last week or so, the most recent Verizon data breach investigations report was released. So we have got some statistics in this presentation from that. But also a lot of this is actually stuff that we know about. And actually we are and have been for a number of years, a contributor to the Verizon data breach investigations report as MWR InfoSecurity. So again, this year we were a contributor to this report. And some of the statistics are reflective of the sorts of things that we see internally as well. So at a high level, as a bit of an overview, you would know, things like hacking-led breaches or hands-on keyboard style attacks. They represent a fairly significant proportion of all sorts of breaches that are reported and recorded. 52% of breaches. That actually hasn't changed very much over the last 5 or 6 years. It's remained fairly consistent at that sort of level. What has been interesting, though, is the decrease in malware-led attacks. And so over the last, actually since 2014, we've seen year-on-year malware-led attacks actually decreasing. Okay, there's probably a number of reasons for why that might be, and there's probably a number of theories. Things like preventative type controls are actually becoming probably a lot better at what they're doing. Patch updates and those sorts of things. Organizations are generally a lot more vigilant over the last sort of 5 years or so at adhering to those patch updates and rolling them out as soon as possible. So that could be one explanation. Another explanation is the increase in artificial intelligence-led or machine learning-led next-gen AV type preventative controls. Those tools have been developed specifically to actually counter malware-led attacks. So all of these are potential reasons for why the decrease in malware-led attacks is consistent over the last 5 or 6 years. But another reason is that we've actually seen a proliferation of criminal groups and cyber criminal groups specifically who have largely they're operating as businesses. They're operating as kind of organizations who employ hackers specifically to go out and run attacks on organizations. And so there's actually been an opportunity for hackers to actually display those skills in a lot more sort of legitimate to a certain extent in these organizations, being able to actually deploy attacks and show off their prowess. And so the resorting to commodity malware is probably less required if these cyber criminal groups have access to hackers who can actually run these sorts of attacks, hands on keyboard style. Ransomware is still actually a concern, for lots of different organizations, and it's remained fairly consistent over the last 2 or 3 years. What has been interesting, though, is that we probably see less attention on ransomware in the media. So, 2 years ago with WannaCry and NotPetya, ransomware was really the media darling. It was all over the mainstream media, all over the newspapers. All sorts of organizations were being hit with ransomware. They're still being hit with ransomware, largely. That hasn't changed. It's just we tend to hear about it slightly less. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the slides to come, because there has been a slight shift in how ransomware is being deployed, but it's still there. Supply chain attacks, again, that's not actually new. Supply chain attacks have been around for a number of years now, and what is new and what is quite interesting is that the way or who's actually deploying or using supply chain type techniques has shifted from what was once just criminal nation states to now criminal groups as well. And so we've got a number of examples of where criminal groups are using much more intelligent and using, I guess, they've done a whole lot more reconnaissance before actually launching an attack. And then lastly, the last point down there is about the financial motivation for different types of attacks. It's 71% of all breaches. Again, that's remained largely consistent. That hasn't changed. However, the point that I wanted to make was that the way that organizations or criminal groups are gaining some sort of financial benefit from attacks is changing a little bit in recent times, and there's some new theories on different ways that and different ways, methods, and different groups that are benefiting from that financial gain as well. So we'll talk about that in a bit as well. So there's 3 things that I really wanted to focus on, which has come about, probably in the last sort of 6 months or so, particularly this year in 2019. The first thing that I wanted to mention was that sophistication is on the rise. That's a fairly obvious sort of statement, I guess, but how is that actually manifesting itself? And in a number of different ways. I mentioned ransomware has remained consistent. What we're seeing, though, is that ransomware is actually becoming much more targeted. It's much more bespoke and unique when it is deployed against an organization. Sometimes, a number of years ago, we were seeing ransomware that was just essentially commodity malware. You'd buy it on the black market, and it would be deployed, and it was kind of a spray and pray type technique. We're seeing less and less of that spray and pray type technique. It's not really just about deploying some sort of malware across an entire estate and just hoping for the best. What we're seeing is that unique code is being developed, and unique pieces of ransomware are being developed and deployed specifically against specific organizations or parts of organizations. And so that in itself is actually quite new. It's quite interesting to see that ransomware is being used in that way. But related to that is the way that distractive attacks are being used. And what I mean by that is that when things like ransomware are deployed, that's often not actually the end objective. The objective is not to get a ransom. In many cases that we've seen this year and at the end of last year, the ransom is not the ideal scenario for the attackers. What they're looking to do is actually perform some other type of attack on another part of the estate while everyone's focused on the ransomware. And we've seen that with ransomware, we've seen that with denial of service type attacks, we've seen it with wipers, and there's some pretty interesting sort of examples that have now been started to think about, we think about them in a different way. Attacks from years ago, we're now starting to realize that in actual fact, they were distractive attacks because something else had happened on that part of the estate at the same time. So the prime example there is the Far East International Bank of Taiwan that had $60 million taken from them. That was 2017. And they actually recovered, the vast the vast majority of that $60 million that was taken, but they were dealing with a ransomware attack at the time as their Swift servers were compromised and that money was taken out the back door. There was a similar example actually just last year, towards the end of last year, on the Bank of Chile. It was $10 million in this scenario. They didn't recover the money, but 9,000 or 9,500 different endpoints, machines, and servers were actually wiped completely from the Bank of Chile, as that $10 million was taken from the Swift servers as well again. So that's something that has been on the rise, and we've seen that within our organization a number of times this year as well. And so, almost to the point where we're now suspicious of when ransomware appears on a client's estate, we have to immediately think, what else is happening on this estate? And so visibility of an entire estate has become so much more important immediately as soon as something like this is being deployed. And then the last one I've just got there is about criminal groups now using supply chain attacks, which I mentioned earlier. All right, the next point I want to make is about attribution evasion. And this is an interesting thing because we're starting to see all sorts of threat actors actually being able to evade attribution by either using the TTPs or methods of another threat actor, or being able to obfuscate completely the different methods that they're using so that we're not actually able to identify who it potentially could be. So obviously, there's a number of potential reasons why organizations would do this. Evading the attribution is obviously is key. Evading capture, shifting the blame, and that's an important one because often that is actually the objective, to shift the blame to another potential nation state or criminal group in order to change a relationship between different organizations or countries. And again, used as a distractive technique. So if you think that you're battling potentially China as a threat actor, maybe you're going to be responding in a slightly different way to if you think you're just responding to a standard sort of criminal group. So it can be an interesting sort of scenario that comes up, and again, we've seen this a number of times. There was an incident on the Australian Parliament actually earlier this year. It was in February this year, whereby even the Prime Minister of Australia and all over the media, the local media in Australia was talking about it being, had all the digital fingerprints of China. It was very obvious that it was. Initially, it was one of only 4 nation states that had the capabilities to hack into the 3 major political parties in Australia, and they were naming, either China, Russia, the US, or Israel. It has to be one of those 4. Eventually they were saying it definitely looks like it's all the hallmarks of China. In fact, it turned out that it was this cyber criminal group, but linked to an Iranian state-backed group called Iridium. And now it's well known that it was actually this group, Iridium, who were the perpetrators of that type of attack. But they had obfuscated the way their methods specifically to look like China. And I mean, for anyone who's aware of what's going on between Australia and China, there's obviously ongoing discussions about their trading relationship and whatever else. And so there was potentially a specific purpose to shift the blame to China specifically to affect that relationship. Again, that could be related to Australia's relationship with the US and the US relationship with Iran. We can, I guess, hypothesize on what that's about, but the real thing to take away from this is that they've done that quite deliberately, and we're seeing this a little bit more and more as we move through 2019. The other thing to keep in mind is that I mentioned earlier, if you think you're battling a nation-state type threat actor, you might be responding in a very different way to if you think this is just a standard criminal group type threat actor. And usually the way that people respond to nation-state type attacks is all hands on deck, everyone get involved, maybe not think about other things at the same time because you're very, very busy working on that particular attack. So criminal groups are now realizing that if they use the hallmarks or the TTPs that are reminiscent of a nation-state type threat actor, they can usually get away with doing something in the background at the same time. So it's related to those distractive attacks. So that's been really interesting to see. All right, the third point I really want to make here is about personally identifiable information and customer data and how that's being used and what reasons people are now stealing that data for. Because once upon a time, we knew, everyone knew that personally identifiable information, customer data, was very lucrative for criminal groups. They were able to steal a whole bunch of data, they were able to sell it on, and there was a huge amount of financial gain behind stealing PII. So the motivation for stealing PII was everyone knew it was financial gain. That was the biggest motivator for stealing customer data. And that's still the case. That is still, one of the biggest reasons behind stealing financial data. So largely, we often thought, stealing customer data was obviously attributable to criminal groups who wanted money, or some nation states who are looking for some sort of financial gain. So what we've seen more recently, and actually this is a theory that's only really coming about from security analysts this year, is that some of the previous attacks that we've seen, whereby customer data has gone missing and we know it's been exfiltrated somewhere, in circumstances where it's taking a really long time to appear on the black market or has never appeared on the black market since, theories are now coming about where that actually might come from. Because if the methods used to take that data are reminiscent of nation states, for example, then potentially that data isn't actually being used for financial gain. And the prime example here that's being discussed at the moment is the Equifax breach from 2017. There were 140 million Americans' financial data stolen in that breach, and we know it has been exfiltrated. We're now talking 18 months down the line, and this is within the time period that we would normally expect to see that data appear somewhere else. Someone else should be using that data already, selling it somewhere, auctioning it off, and making some money. We haven't seen that yet. We're 18 months down the line and we haven't seen that yet, and yet that attack has used some of the methods that are reminiscent of the way China operates. So the theory that is now surrounding this particular attack is that that was potentially a Chinese criminal group or a Chinese-backed criminal group, and they were looking to get that data because of a database that they're building of individuals and their personally identifiable information. Largely, it's well known that the Marriott hack, again, where a whole bunch of customer data was stolen, China was behind that. So there are a number of examples now where we're seeing not just China, but a number of different nation states actually taking and going after customer data and not for financial gain. Now, why that might be, we can probably hypothesize again as to what they're doing with that data, but we know that one of the MOs of some nation states is bribery and blackmail of individuals, particularly when they're in some key industries, and all sorts of nation states have been known to do that. So that's potentially a really great way to be able to bribe and blackmail individuals, is by having their customer data and being able to use that against them. Another reason is that you can start to build a picture of who might be engaged in espionage activity. And this is probably the biggest reason for why we think nation states would be going after PII, is that it gives them a really clear picture, particularly the Equifax data. It will give them a very clear picture of who within the US specifically might be engaged in those espionage activities. The last reason is that there is obviously a great way for nation states to then use that for future attacks. If they've got a database of customer data with a whole bunch of individuals from another country, being able to build things like phishing campaigns and doing reconnaissance for future attacks is actually made a lot easier, because they've got this very clear picture about who's where and who does what and what's going on. So that is something that, only in 2019 have we started to see that might have been the case from previous attacks. And it's one of the things that is concerning security analysts just now, is that PII, which was once only used for, or thought to only be related to financial gain, is now being used potentially for some much more strategic and potentially sinister activities. All right, so those three things, I think, just key to remember. Obviously, the attribution, evasion, the PII sort of stuff, and that sophistication is on the rise, particularly when it comes to, distractive attacks and ransomware, etc. I wanted to just briefly touch on two key US sectors that we work with a fair bit, and maybe some specifics around those specific sectors. But again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the threat intelligence is only useful when it's specific to your organization. So in order to actually make it specific to your organization, you need to be thinking about your specific risk appetite, where you might be exposed within your business, and that might be from a client exposure, it might be the jurisdictions that your organization operates in, it might be any number of things, but taking the information from a broader perspective and making it specific to your organization is really, really key to be able to respond to the various threats that are about there. So we'll talk about this in a fairly high level. The graph that I've got there, the pie graph, is talking about the attack motivation behind various attacks on this industry. And there's really only two reasons why people go after the financial sector. Obviously, there's a financial gain. That's a huge motivation for attacks. And there's a small amount of espionage that goes on. There's really no other reasons why people go after the financial sector. That is largely, covers everything. Every different type of attack we see on the financial sector can be related back to these sorts of motivations. So that's not new. We know that there is largely a financial gain to be had from going after the financial sector. But as always, the financial sector has been one of the most targeted sort of industries. What we do know, though, is that the financial sector is probably one of the most advanced sectors in their defensive sort of measures. They've understood that they're highly targeted, and they understand that they need to be doing something about that, and they've understood that for a number of years. So being able to resource and budget for defensive measures is something that the financial sector is quite good at. What organizations maybe aren't that great at doing is being able to identify specific attack paths or specific goals or objectives within their organization that a criminal group or that a nation state potentially are going after. And that is something that we as a business actually work quite closely with organizations to understand is, what are the crown jewels within your estate? And you might think it's this, and we might think it's this, and maybe it's both of these, or maybe it's none of those. But being able to talk that through and really understand what are the attack paths to get to those crown jewels is critical. It's absolutely key. So, undisclosed price-sensitive information continues to be a really, really big thing for all financial services type organizations. There tends to be a whole lot of M&A transactional type data that they hold. That's actually, by the by, it's actually true for the legal sector as well. So anyone from the legal sector needs to be very, very well aware of any sort of M&A transaction that they're working on and making sure that that data is very, very secure, because there is a strong motivation for going after that sort of data. One of the things that came out of the Verizon data breach report just last week was this statistic around customer churn. In the financial sector, this actually leads to a much, much higher rate of losing customers than in any other sector. When a breach is announced from a bank or another sort of financial organization, customers, they run out the door. They're leaving immediately. So the statistic there is 6.1% of customers are lost rather than 3.4%, which is fairly standard amongst all sorts of different types of industries. I've got there a point about size and reputation obviously have an impact on the financial sector, and that is true, but to maybe an inverse sort of effect. What we know is that, for example, North Korea, they are highly motivated to go after the financial sector, but they tend to be going after much smaller and less well-known banks. And the Far East International Bank of Taiwan, I'd never heard of until that attack. That was largely considered to be North Korea. The Bank of Chile, which $10 million, not enormous, not insignificant, but that was considered to be North Korea as well. And they're probably the biggest threat actor that does go after the banks for financial gain, because they actually need the money. But they're unlikely to go after a huge American bank that has a very well-known international reputation. It's probably because the defensive measures that they would come up against are probably a little bit too difficult for them to come up against. So nation states in this particular scenario are unlikely to be going after, the large financial institutions. So size and reputation can have an impact, but it's an inverse impact on, whether or not you're going to be targeted. Yes, big organizations will always be targeted by criminal groups, and large financial groups will always, need to ensure that they are defending themselves from those criminal groups, but they're unlikely to have, a nation state come after them specifically for financial gain, and whereby there are nation states going after financial services, it's unlikely to be the biggest names in town. And the last thing that I've got there is in the US, the recovery costs are much, much higher than the rest of the world. So recovering from a breach for the financial services sector in the US is enormous in comparison to Europe, Asia, the rest of the world. So it's something that we really need to be conscious of here, is that any sort of defensive measures are going to have a much more bigger impact on the potential cost associated with breaches than anywhere else in the world. So that's important for any global organization to be aware of, in that the US market is specific in having these very, very elevated post-breach sort of costs. So just something to be aware of. The last sector I want to talk about is just the health services sort of sector. And this is an interesting one for us. And actually, this graph is quite interesting because the attack motivations for going after the health service is, diverse. Yes, okay, a large percentage of that is still financial gain, but we start to see some reasons behind attacks on the health service that we just don't see across any other sector. Things like just for fun. Why not go after a hospital just for fun? I mean, that's fairly concerning, but that's something like 6%, I think it's there. 6% of all attacks, breaches on the health service are just for fun. Convenience, grudges, I mean, that's quite concerning. It's a diverse attack motivation for this particular industry that other industries just don't have to deal with. So that's very, very unique. And again, that's something that I think can help inform how then defensive measures are built. Yes, if we know what those motivations are, we can start to link that to specific threat actors. We can start to think about how those threat actors then operate, what are the methods, the TTPs that they use, which then starts to inform what the potential attack paths could be. So you start to build a bit of a picture of what you should be prioritizing your budgeting and resourcing on. Another couple of key points about the health service. There are obviously a very, very different, the staffing and the employee base of the health service is very different to professional services or financial services. They're generally not as IT savvy. They're not meant to be IT savvy. They are working on saving lives, and they are working on providing, a critical service to the public. So nurses, doctors, for example, and other sort of health professionals aren't necessarily that aware that they should be, accepting that patch update for their laptop from their IT department, or aren't necessarily aware that, clicking on that phishing email is probably not the best idea, or even identifying something as a phishing email. So the rates of phishing emails for the health service are extremely high in comparison to professional services or financial services. So things like awareness campaigns, training, all of that sort of stuff is now critical for the health service. The health service in the US represents the most targeted industry at the moment. So even more than financial services, health services, and that's anything from hospitals to medical rooms to health insurance sort of companies, going after customer data from the health service is highly lucrative, but is generally considered a lot easier by criminal groups than other industries. So there will be attacks on this sector far more wide-reaching and having a much, much bigger impact because they don't necessarily have the same understanding from a defensive perspective as those other sectors.